All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 12:30. Welcome back or welcome to our online dairy education series. This is the last webinar in our series that's been going on now for a couple of weeks. So we're wrapping it up with the best speaker on the program, right, Joe? Save the best for last.
I
Just
don't know
kidding.
about that.
Yeah, right. I don't want to say just kidding because, of course, it's going to be excellent. But we've had a great, group of presenters, lots of really good information, and just got a note from Susan Brulette that the webinars, are being recorded and they're being posted on our website under the conference tab. So she's going to put that in to the chat box. So if you did miss any of them or, didn't quite kind of wanted to go back and listen again, they are posted on our website. So you can keep listening over and over and over again. Just quickly, I want to thank the various organizations that provide us support to bring education to you. So the USDA, NIFA, USDA SARE, and USDA Risk Management have all contributed to this webinar series in various ways. So thanks to them for their continued support. And let's see, we do have some CCA credits available today. So once the webinar is over, we'll make sure to put up the QR code and you can scan that and get your credits. So let's see, I think that's all I have. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe Lawrence. And Joe is the Dairy Forage Systems Specialist with Cornell Pro Dairy Team. And he's from the Northeast, and he's been working in the dairy industry his whole life. Grew up on a farm in northern New York, and then went on to work as an extension educator and then a crop advisor, and now at Cornell Extension. And we've been really lucky to be able to work with Joe currently and over the years, especially building this corn silage hybrid testing program, which he's going to talk a little bit about today. And so with that, Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Heather.
Right.
I'll try to share my screen here. And so yeah, I'll kind of touch on a few different things, corn silage related, if I can get it to go. And yeah, I mean, feel free to interrupt at any point with questions.
Okay. I'll watch the chat box, and so folks know, get your questions in and we'll get those answered.
And I see Kurt's on the line again today. I attended the session on Wednesday with Kurt Sid, and that was excellent. And I tell people up front, I'm an agronomist by training, and I dip my toes into some of this forage quality nutrition stuff, and sometimes maybe I get in over my head, so Kurt can correct me here. Usually I have some nutritionist on the line that can rein me back in. But yeah, so like Heather said, we've had a really great collaboration the last 5 or so years, and well, even before that. But we had what I'm going to talk a lot about today is our corn silage hybrid evaluation program. And here in New York, kind of went on hiatus after the 2012 or 2013 season when Bill Cox retired. And when I was hired with Pro Dairy in 2016, one of the charges was to get the program back up and running. And then in 2017, I was just exploring what our neighboring states were doing and stuff, and reached out to Heather to see if there was any interest in collaborating. And she was open to the idea, and it's been awesome to as a way to kind of share resources. And we're all tight on resources, so we get to share resources and get more data and get a wider geographic representation for the data. So we take entries from companies. We don't choose what they enter, they choose what they enter. And we group them either in 80 to 95 day relative maturities or 96 to 110 day. And I encourage people to not get caught up on the exact locations, but rather the growing conditions we get at those locations, because if you look at the two states, quite frankly, there's some gaps in the map, right? But if you look at the type of soils and the weather conditions that we tend to get at these locations, they do represent the region pretty well. So it may not be right, the results may not be right from your backyard, but they are certainly, you can usually pick out a location that has rainfall, growing degree days, weather that is similar to where you're at. So so we try to focus in on the and highlight the weather conditions at the sites so people can get a sense of what best matches for them. Last year's program, we had a record number of entries, at 90 entries from 17 different brands of seed. And I always like to thank the companies that are involved, because if they didn't enter hybrids, then we wouldn't have a program to run. So I was just saying to Heather before we started here today, where entries are a little slower to come in this year. We're still waiting on a few more, and certainly understand for some companies that it's been a challenging year, like it has for the rest of us. But we will have our program again this year. It might be a little smaller than our record number last year, but we're excited to keep it going. And so I'm just going to start out with a little background. And if you've looked at our trials, you may have noticed some of this, but this is the first time I think I've spoken to kind of more the Vermont, New England area about this. So I figured I'd refresh things a little bit. For years, a lot of programs use like the Milk 2000 or Milk 2006 type approach from Wisconsin, where it used forage quality parameters to predict milk production per ton of forage, and if you had yields, you could predict milk production per acre. And I just like to remind people that it's kind of like the yield monitor on your combine. You have to have it calibrated, and you have to put good data into these ranking metrics in order to get good data out, or that garbage in, garbage out type of analogy. So we're always thinking, when we use these ranking metrics for corn silage, like, what is the data we're putting into it? Are we getting representative forage samples? Is it green versus fermented samples? Do we have all the proper values to plug into the equation to get it to predict an answer for us? And we also should always keep in mind that it's relative to the criteria that was used for the ranking. And I think we have gotten into the trap of kind of misusing these metrics sometimes, and because really it's really a relative ranking, right? It's really relative to the location, to the type of growing season you had. So I often say, the yield, I don't get hung up on whether the yield was 18 tons or 22 tons, but was it 5% better or below average? Because the average is going to change from year to year, right? So I'll show a few examples of that as we go through, but I just like to start out with that, and then to get to some of these ranking metrics, because there's been a lot of them, especially after years and years of the Milk 2006 type approach being the only one on the market. There's been a whole flurry of them in recent years. What I like to say about Milk 2006 is that it was good tool when it came out, and using the nutritional knowledge that was prevalent at the time in terms of ration formulation. But as the name implied, it was last updated in 2006. And as you heard from Kurt, if you were on the call on what was it, Wednesday or Tuesday, there's been a lot of advances in nutritional science around like fiber digestibility and stuff. And this model just didn't take those into account because those new understandings simply weren't there when the model was created. There was an update for alfalfa in 2016, and I kind of had to cross out the no update for corn silage because there is a milk 2020 model that they're testing out and working with. And so, that is kind of recognizing some of the updates and on fiber digestibility and stuff that are needed. So there are some updates coming there. But in the meantime, people were searching for other ways to rank stuff. And when we restarted the program in 2016, working with Tom Overton and Mike Van Amberg and some of the animal nutrition folks at Cornell, the idea was, why don't we feed these corn silages right into the Cornell nutrition model, which is kind of the backbone for ration balancing and a lot of softwares that are out there today and used on farm. And with the idea that we could build a diet to feed a cow and have the model predict an outcome, and then we could take out the corn silage that we use to build the model and put in one of the corn silage samples from our project and see what that did to the model. So we set it up for 100 pounds of milk, and these are the parameters that get used. And then we use basically like an average corn silage, an average alfalfa haylage, and a little bit of straw. And we balance that diet for 100 pounds of milk and 60 pounds of dry matter intake. So a relatively high high corn silage diet. And then we could take out that average corn silage and put in any of our samples and see what it did to milk production. And there's some pros and cons to doing this. So we're not rebalancing the whole ration. So if you put a new corn silage into a ration on your farm, you might adjust the haylage, or you might adjust the corn meal, or you might adjust some other supplement in the diet to rebalance the nutrients. We're not doing that because we're trying to see what the effect of just the corn silage is. And so it's not a perfect system, but we do feel like it's a fairly interesting way to just look at the relative differences in the corn silage. And again, we're not getting hung up on if it's predicting 100 pounds of milk or 105 pounds of milk or 92 pounds of milk. We're really looking at the relative differences, not the absolute predictions, because we know, that's just a model, right? So then there's some other equations that have come out in recent years that are kind of interesting. One is called the RFC, Rumen Fill Index, and that's a pretty simple one. It's only 3 numbers. Larry and Joanna Jones had worked on this, and it actually corresponds pretty well to some of our predictions from the Cornell nutrition model. And if you have samples analyzed at Cumberland Valley Labs, you'll actually see this analysis on your report. So that's another option that's out there. Another one is one that was worked on, in Pennsylvania between Penn State and Chris Canale at Cargill. And the idea with this is it accounts for both the content and digestibility of fiber and starch. So it's really trying to calculate the total organic matter digestibility of the sample, and it's a spreadsheet based calculation. And that group has been using that with their corn silage trials the last couple growing seasons. And then Minor Institute has a cool spreadsheet on their website where you can put in your yield, NDF levels, NDF digestibility, starch content, starch digestibility, and calculate the actual yield per acre of digestible fiber and starch. And that's another approach. So, you know, we got all these options, and that creates some frustration. People are thinking, well, you know, this is just confusing, muddying the waters even more. What should we do? And I don't disagree with that. And we're guilty of that because we you know, came up with one of these new approaches to kind of test out, and it does muddy the water a little bit. But what we've seen is basically all these new approaches, while they take slightly different angles, they're pretty well correlated with each other. And they're much more closely correlated with each other than they were with Milk 2006. So it certainly suggests that we're all moving in the right direction, or the same direction, based on some of the new nutritional sciences. And you know, I think that's what you have to keep in mind, is none of these are perfect. They all have strengths and weaknesses. They all really are only useful in the context of the data set you're working with. And again, we have to be careful not to you know, put too much weight on the information, but just really find what works for your farm, for the advisors you're working with, and what parameters have the most impact on your program. And if you keep that in mind, you can, you know, can be useful information that comes out of any of them, as long as you're really thinking about what your farm needs, and you understand what parameters the ranking is giving you. So that's kind of my background spiel on where we're at today, and how to kind of sift through some of the confusion with some of this, and find what works best for you. So now I'll move on with some of the information. So we put together a traditional report, and I forgot to ask Heather what the link was for the UVM website, but maybe that can go in the chat or something. But this is, so we have a traditional report where we list all the hybrids, all the relevant information in these big tables. And some people like to sift through these and see, what hybrid ranked the best and that sort of thing. I actually honestly kind of discourage using these tables that way and just kind of picking out the best ranked hybrid, and I'll get into why that is in a minute. But it really comes down to using the it really comes down to using the information as a data set, and not necessarily as an individual, because I do think if you pick one location and pick out one individual hybrid from that location, and think that's going to work for you because it performed well in the trials, it could lead you in the wrong direction, because it could lead you towards something that maybe looked good in that location but doesn't actually fit your program. So one way we present the data is with these plots where we plot two parameters against each other. Again, in this case, it was milk yield and crop yield. And basically what happens is, as you move up, move from left to right, you're getting higher milk yield. And if you move from bottom to top, higher crop yield. And so if you get up here in this top right corner, you're basically above average in both yield and quality. Conversely, if you're down here in the bottom left corner, you're below average in both yield and quality. So that's how, one way we present this data to try to give a better snapshot of it. And this is what one of those graphs would look like in the report. So and again, because we're more concerned about kind of relative matters, we put it as 100%. So the plot average, in this case, the plot average yield was 28.5 tons per acre, but it really doesn't matter if the plot average yield was 28 tons or 22 tons. What matters is how other things performed relative to that. So you'll see 100% here. And that means, in this case, that equals that 28.5 tons. But now if you look at it as just being 100%, you can see, is it 5% better or 5% worse than that, than the plot average? And you can look at it in terms of both yield and quality. So that's how we present that. And then just a little statistics reminder. Least significant difference. The idea here is that if you have numbers that are really tight together, you'll have a small least significant difference. So in other words, a small difference between values can be statistically significant. But other times you have these really, really big differences. So you have 3 samples that still average together to give you an average of 50, but there's a ton of variation there. So you're going to have a really large LSD value, which is going to mean that basically even, there could be a couple ton difference in yield, and it's still not statistically significant because there was so much variability. So if we think about that in the context of that chart that I just showed, we put the LSD values down here in the corner, and I joke for, now we have our GPS things on our cell phones, but I joke that it's like the scale on an old map, right? Like 1 inch equals 1 mile type of thing. So if you use that, and I animated a little example here, if you think of that LSD value and what it means in terms of if it's significant or not, I picked one of our plots that had pretty big LSD values because I wanted to highlight the differences. And in this case, there was a lot of variability at this plot, which is unfortunate, but that happens sometimes in field research. So if we pick a hybrid and move this up, computer screen's glitching a little bit here, but if we move this up onto, say, hybrid 17, and basically anything in the blue, even though it's numerically a different value, statistically it's not different. So it's only, compared to hybrid 17, it's only these guys way down here that actually statistically yielded less. And if we do the same thing on the milk side, basically anything in this area statistically yielded the same, even though there's variability. So it's only these guys down here that actually were statistically lower in predicted milk yield than hybrid 17. So I just like to remind folks of that, because you can get hung up in seeing that there's a 5% difference, but if you have a lot of plot variability like we happen to have at this location, that may not be statistically significant. And so that gets us to the next part of this. So what should we be focusing on if we don't necessarily see this a lot of statistical differences on some of our plots, like that one I just showed you? How else can we use the data? And we've been doing a lot of work related to how the growing environment impacts crop performance. And we've known for several years that the weather can definitely impact performance. Obviously, we know it can impact stuff like yield and ear development, but we've seen there's more and more data showing how it affects fiber digestibility too. And I like using this example from Rick Grant at Minor. If you notice the date on this newsletter, it was August 2017, and he was predicting in August that we'd have high UNDF forages. So just a reminder that U is undigested NDF. So if we have high UNDF, that's a bad thing. It means there's a higher percentage of that NDF that's not digestible. So he was predicting in August of 2017 we were going to have these high UNDF forages. And, while we can't change the weather or turn on or off the rain, we do know that high rainfall tends to lead to poorer digestibility. So if you know this in August, based on the growing season we've had, maybe it's time that you start talking to your nutritionist about what you're going to be feeding next winter when you have to start feeding this new crop of corn silage. In August, is there a good buy on some supplement that might help out your diet when you have to start feeding this high UNDF forage? And can you lock that in August and make sure you're going to have it for the winter? So if you can start using it as a strategy to plan ahead, even though you can't necessarily control the weather in the field. And when let's see here. So when we look at our trials, we keep track of the precipitation and growing degree days from planting to harvest. And as some of you certainly probably remember or don't want to remember, 2017 was a pretty wet, cool growing season. And then if we contrast that with something like 2018 or 2020, where we tended to be warmer and drier, we see, we can see some pretty big differences in terms of the growing season we had. And if you look at the pattern of these bars from year to year, what can be interesting is if we pick up a few of our key forage parameters out of our trials. So here's that UNDF number. Again, in this case, a lower number is better. And here's our starch values. We can follow that. We can almost see these values following the same pattern as the weather did for those seasons. If we think about UNDF, Rick was absolutely right in August of 2017. Right, we see that on a percentage. This is a percent of all the samples we took that year, and we see that percentage kind of peaks out with a UNDF at 13 or 14, and there's quite a few more samples, probably over 50% total of what we took that year was over that 13 to 14 level. If we contrast that with 2018 or 2020, when we had much less rainfall and a little more heat, we see that we peaked out with over 50% of the samples in that 9 to 10 range. And on the flip side, we know that starch is driven by rainfall after tasseling and how good of a fall we have for dry down. And we see, again, 2017, we peaked out with the highest number of samples back here, 32 to 34% starch, versus like 2020, which was just a crazy year for at least at our locations, where 30% of the samples we took were in that 30 to 40 range, and another 25% were 40 or more. And this gets me back to, one, those planning purposes, and two, how do you use the trial data? So I already mentioned that I don't think it's the best use of the data to go to the table and just pick out the highest ranking hybrid at a certain location. But what I would suggest is that this is a way to calibrate yourself to the growing season. And when you're working with whoever your seed representative is, you can say, all right, I know in 2020, corn generally had really high starch levels. So how do your hybrids compare to that? And where's your data from 2020 to say how these how your hybrids did in that year? Because if you just picked an absolute number and told them I want to starch over 25 or over 35 or at 35 and picked an arbitrary number like that, in 2020, it can be really easy to find a starch higher than that, right? Even some of the poorer hybrids the company might have in their portfolio probably accomplish that in 2020. But in 2017, it would have, they would have been searching their database to find some of the better performing ones that could have even hit that 35 mark. So I just, I think this is a way to calibrate ourselves to the data and keep, have this in mind when we're evaluating other plot research to really understand how that hybrid performed relative to the season that you're looking at the data from. And so then there's the next question of how much do genetics really have an impact versus the growing environment. And some different groups have looked at this over the years. And if you're interested in more information, there's a link to an article here that we put together. But we had the opportunity to work with both our trials with Heather in Vermont, as well as the folks at Penn State, and pull data for where we had the same set of hybrids growing across several locations. So you can see here we had 4 hybrids across 7 locations in 2017, 3 hybrids across 8 locations in 2019. And what we did is analyze for what had a bigger impact, the location it was grown at, or the different genetics, the different hybrids grown at that location. And we consistently saw for some of these major parameters that there was a bigger variation between locations than there was between hybrids at the same location. So yes, there could be little differences between hybrids at the same location, but in general, the weather really pushed what happened, where if you took different locations with different weather events, we saw much bigger variability. Certainly there's exceptions to this, like BMR, which we know has higher fiber digestibility, but again, it just gets us back to what has a bigger impact and what can we control. And in this case, the environment did. It doesn't mean genetics aren't important for other reasons, right? Like there still is some genetic variability in some of the forage quality parameters, and there's definitely some genetic variability in terms of like agronomics and plant hardiness and stuff like that, right? So but it just gives you an idea of what, where we can really put our focus. Another example from our trials of how that comparing genetics to location. This was an example from 2016 when we had 29 different hybrids grown at 2 locations. And as I mentioned, when we feed these into the Cornell model, we set it for a target of 60 pounds of dry matter intake, which is the red line here. And then as we change out these other corn silages, the model says, all right, this corn silage is more digestible. The cows can eat more of this ration now. Or on the other side, this corn silage is less digestible and the cows can eat less of it. And so what do we see here? Well, in this growing season, our Aurora location was dry, borderline drought stress. So we had lower overall yields, but we had highly digestible corn silage. And so you can see with the orange bars that pretty much almost every scenario, the model said, okay, with this corn silage, the cows can eat more than that 60 pounds we were predicting. On the flip side, we're Madrid, where we had more rainfall and which led to better overall yields. It also drove down digestibility, and we can see in most scenarios here, that drove down intake, and the model said, okay, those cows can't eat that much anymore. And generally, so number 1 represents hybrid number 1 grown at 2 different locations, and we see variation both in hybrid and location, right? But in a lot of cases, we see as much or more difference between the same hybrid at 2 different locations as we do variation in how the different hybrids performed at the same location. So just another example of that type of pattern that we see. So another way we present the data is just a summary for each location of the averages for some of the important parameters that we look at. And this gets back to kind of using the averages to calibrate yourself to the growing season. And kind of having a good idea of what was a good range for one year versus another, and also looking at how your crop on your farm relates to that. So I put together a draft of this sheet, and I shared it with Susan. So I think she may be posting it with the presentation later on from today. But we often talk about benchmarking different things, and this was my concept, and I'm not saying it's a good one. It's still a work in progress. So you guys can give me some feedback and see if it works or not. But I was trying to think of a way to help benchmark this, and what how you could kind of compare your samples from your own farm. And so what I did is I color coded the rainfall and growing degree days based on, and put a percentage in. So as we know, 2017, across our locations, it was 26% above average in rainfall. So a wet year, but only 91% of the average growing degree days. So wet and dry, compared to like 2018, where it was rainfall was only 76% of normal, but the growing degree days were 108% of normal. So you can kind of find what might have been the scenario at your location for a given year, and then look at what some of the averages were in terms of yield, starch, fiber digestibility, that sort of thing. And even if you wanted to write in your own numbers here. Again, I know this isn't a perfect scenario because it's averaged and stuff together, but just trying to think of ways to give people a chance to say, all right, how did my corn truly perform compared to what we kind of experienced around the region in the last growing season. All right, so now shifting gears a little bit more into kind of more the management side of things, and using a couple of our trials to give some examples on management. Again, back to what we can control versus what we can't control, in that classic circle that we've all seen of, what's important, what you can actually control, and where do they overlap. So, we know weather, we can't necessarily control that very well. But how do we put ourselves in the best position for quality corn silage? And I'm going to use some more data from our hybrid evaluation program that I already explained to you, but I wanted to introduce another study that I'm going to use some information from. And we had a 2-year project here in New York where we planted 4 different hybrids at a group of farms. And at harvest, we wanted to see, because we had big, tall, leafy hybrids, we had some shorter stature dual purpose hybrids, we had different relative maturities, and we wanted to see how all that stuff affected how well the chopper performed in terms of kernel processing score and length of cut and other things as it tried to chop these different hybrids. So I'll use some data from this study too. And what it all boils down to, and kind of the rest of what I'm going to talk about, is really how do we put ourselves in the driver's seat so that we pick the time of harvest based on when the crop is at the desirable place where we want it, versus letting Mother Nature kind of force our hand in terms of it's really muddy, or there's a frost coming or something like that, and then we end up having to harvest when it's less than ideal, and the crop's not quite where we want it. So what's the implications of that? Well, this is actually some good data out of Wisconsin that I think kind of drives the point home a little bit. So this was actually something kind of driven by, what was it, the 2017 season, when we had some really late planted corn, or maybe 2019, but when we had a really wet spring and some corn planted well into June. And some people were asking the question, what if my corn's not going to make it for silage? When should I harvest it? And one of the points that was made here was corn can have pretty good fiber digestibility before it tassels out. It is a grass plant, and the old saying with grasses that once you see the head, the quality's dead. That kind of holds true for corn too. Once it heads out, the fiber digestibility really takes a big hit. But then what happens with a corn plant that doesn't happen with Timothy or Reed's Canary or something? It develops an ear, and that ear has three benefits. It increases overall tonnage, it brings starch into the mix, and it also because that there is fiber in the ear, and it's quite and there's more content in the ear. It's a kind of a dilution factor with higher yield, is that you dilute out that lower fiber digestibility in the stalk. And so you actually see a rebound in overall fiber digestibility. So if you can get to that second peak of quality where we want to harvest corn silage, you get the best of both worlds. But if you're forced to harvest early and harvest that corn when the ear's not mature enough, you can really take a big hit there, and both in yield and quality. And this table kind of tries to quantify what that hit is on the yield side. And we see here percent of max yield. So this is saying that about that our 5.5 growth stage, we're at 100% of our yield potential. And even if we go back to R5, which is a dense stage, we're only getting 75 to 85% of that total. So we've already taken a big hit in our total yield potential just in that time period there. And when we look at some actual data, Heather actually collected this data, though I'm not even sure she knows she collected it for us. But we threw in some Czech hybrids in the trials a few years. And so it kind of worked out really well by coincidence. We weren't even really planning on it, but we ended up with a set of 4 hybrids that were planted on the exact same day, but harvested on two different days, a week apart, one with our short season trials and one with our long season trials. So it gave us an opportunity to look at the exact same hybrids planted on the same day at the same location, but a week's difference in harvest timing. And so the first harvest was September 12th, and it was already decent, right? It was 32.4% dry matter. So it's not like we were dealing with 28% dry matter corn silage here or something. It was already at 32, which isn't bad. But then we waited a week, and we gained almost 5 points of dry matter. So that must have been a pretty good week of drying weather in between. Fiber digestibility really didn't change a whole lot in that week, and we wouldn't expect it to that much that time of year. But look at what starch did. And starch is really a driver of more yield because you're converting that milk in the kernels into dry matter yield in the form of starch. And so we see over a 4-point change in starch and a couple ton change in yield by waiting that extra week. So if you're harvesting at a time of year where the weather's still fairly decent, you're in the driver's seat of saying, no, I want to wait another week and get those benefits. But if you move these dates out, and this first date's the beginning of October, and you're really scared to leave it in the field in another week because rain's coming, then you're forced to harvest it here, and you don't get to have that benefit or that luxury of waiting to try to capture the better yielding and quality stuff. So that was an example of one plot that we had. So often we get the question, well, that's one year, one location. How's that compare across bigger data sets? So courtesy of Grav Goyle with Bayer, I talked to him about this issue, and he goes, well, we have a lot of data from all across the country, in our data set. It's not as a controlled, replicated research as you have, but there's a lot of it. And so he pulled all that data together and basically did a comparison of what if that silage was harvested too wet, and we define that as 28 to 31% dry matter, or if it was in the target range, which he defined 32 to 35%, which, again, 32 might still be a little wet, but it gave us a range to work with. And what did we see what did we give up when we harvested too wet versus the target? Well, we lost about 1.5 tons of yield. Again, fiber digestibility didn't change a whole lot, but we lost some starch. And this is, a lot of comparisons, right? And I wouldn't necessarily get hung up on the numbers. Like, it's not going to be 1.5 tons every single time, obviously, but just the direction the arrows go, right? Is it a negative or a positive? And we see that this big data set kind of shows us the same thing as the smaller data sets. And what about comparing hybrids at different maturities? Well, if we go from a 90 to a 95-day corn and you get to harvest them at the same dry matter, in this case, their data set shows that it's about 1.1 tons of yield. However, if we have to harvest them in a different dry matter, that yield benefit goes down. In this case, it's still positive, but we can see in these other scenarios it's negative. So it goes from a positive benefit to yield from having a longer season relative maturity to actually having a negative, because yes, it was longer season. It had the potential to yield more, but because we couldn't get it to the right dry matter, we didn't realize that potential. And we see the same sort of trend with the different forage quality parameters. So as we look at that with this larger data set, we can think about relative maturities, and are we really growing the ones that fit our season the best? And I think it's a good question to ask ourselves and reevaluate all the time as our weather kind of changes. Is we do want to grow the longest season hybrids we can responsibly grow, because there are some yield benefits to it. But as soon as we cross that tipping point to stuff that just doesn't fit our area anymore, we give up more than we potentially gain. And I'll give you a couple of my arguments for that. So again, going back to a small controlled study versus a bigger data set, Bill Cox did some work at Cornell where he found that on average, for every 5 days you went up in relative maturity, you gained about 0.5 ton per acre. So again, but just like that other data set we were looking at, that assumes that you're harvesting them both at the proper maturity, the proper dry matter. You only gain that 0.5 ton per acre if you can harvest them both at the same maturity. If you're unable to harvest them at the same maturity, and as we already saw, you can potentially lose more than you stand to gain. So what are some of the other risks involved in it? Well, if we take the study from Cornell and say 0.5 ton of yield and put that on a percentage basis, I just did a range here from 18 to 25 tons, and you see it's a 2 to almost 3% of our yield, right, can be gained. Well, what happens if we get into the mud and we have to raise the cutter bar 6 inches to stay out of the mud? Well, now we've just given up about 1 ton per acre, or double what we might have gained with that longer season hybrid. So we've easily lost everything we could have gained and more. Now, this isn't to say, we have this cutter height discussion every few years. If you have a bumper crop and you raise the cutter bar to try to get better quality because you don't need the tonnage because it's such a high yielding crop, there is some benefits to that. And this summary from Penn State kind of summarizes a whole bunch of studies on what the benefits of that can be. But that's you choosing to do that because you have extra forage. In this case, it's you're being forced to do it because of the weather conditions. And again, you're probably losing more than you stood to gain by growing a longer season crop. Another example is just plain wet silage. We know that if you harvest too wet, it doesn't ferment properly. And for those of you that work and have measured shrink, especially like in bunk silos, it can be big, and it doesn't take very long at all to get 2 or 3% extra shrink in a bunk silo when you have wet corn silage, especially if it's not packed well. So shrink losses in storage can easily exceed any sort of gains you can make if you're forced to harvest too wet. And then finally, frost. I couldn't really find any numbers to quantify this, but again, you know, between immature ears affecting both starch levels and overall yield, and just, you know, again, either way too wet or way too dry at harvest because of the frost affecting fermentation, it's probably not going to take very long to lose, you know, 2 or 3% of that yield from a frost. So those are my arguments for, you know, why there's can be more risk than reward in terms of going too long on relative maturities. So now the kind of the final part here on the harvest side. So we've put ourselves in the best position to harvest. And obviously there's a lot of important factors in terms of, you know, whole plant dry matter, trying to get the target correct for ensiling. You know, how's the chopper set up in terms of are you getting good kernel processing and that sort of thing. And then there's been a lot more discussion in the last few years in terms of the correlation between whole plant dry matter and kernel maturity, and how should we be looking at kernel dry matter, kernel maturity relative to whole plant dry matter. So I'm going to use some of our study results to give a few examples for this. First, just looking at grow and degree days and how the weather impacts the corn and dry down. I mean, grow and degree days are a good tool. They're certainly better, more precise than calendar days in terms of tracking progress. But there's also the last season served as a pretty good reminder to us that not all grow and degree days are created equal. And if you key in on the bars here that are highlighted in orange, so what I did here is the orange to yellow is kind of the range of grow and degree days that these hybrids would need to reach corn silage maturity. And you can see, I guess if we start back here, you can see some years we just totally missed the boat, right? We were forced to harvest early for whatever reason. And again, we just didn't even get the number of grow and degree days we needed, and the whole plant dry matters reflect that. But how about a year like 2020 when we had plenty of grow and degree days, and we hit it pretty darn good at 2 of our locations in terms of, well, actually at all 3 of them. But if we look here, you know, we were right in the middle of that range for the grow and degree days needed. We averaged about 36% whole plant dry matter. And, you know, it lined up the way we would expect it to. But then look at our Madrid, New York location. And that had the most grow and degree days, yet it had the lowest average dry matter. And these were the exact same hybrids planted at these locations. So, you know, what was driving that? Well, I think a lot of it was the fact that we had some pretty good drought stress before tasseling. And so we had that crop really suffered before tasseling, but then after tasseling, we got some decent rain events that really helped the crop for the rest of the season. And we were watching that crop. We were watching the grow and degree days. It was getting plenty of grow and degree days, and yet it was still just a few points wetter than everything else. And we kept watching it, kept waiting, and that crop just took advantage of the nicer weather and a little more rainfall at the end of the growing season, and really made up for lost time. And so by being patient and waiting, we captured a pretty high quality corn silage off of that plot, but we had to wait longer to get it. We couldn't just go off growing degree days. We had to really watch the crop do whole plant dry matters and stuff, because if we had just gone off growing degree days and harvested it back here, like where we harvested Aurora, it was only about 30% whole plant dry matter at that point in time. So if we weren't paying attention to all the factors, we could have ended up with a crop we really weren't happy with and was too wet. But if you had time and you were in a position where you could wait a little bit longer without worrying about the weather really turning on you, we gave, it really finished off well and paid off to wait. So how does the ear versus stover dry matter contribute to whole plant dry matter? That kernel processing study we had, we separated all the ears from the stover and looked at the different components and how that contributed to overall dry matter. So in this case, the black line is the whole plant dry matter, and up here, this green line is the ear dry matter in 2018. This blue dotted line is the ear dry matter in 2019. So a pretty big difference between the two seasons. And if we think back to those two seasons, 2018 was warm. We had really good conditions for dry down, versus 2019 when it was quite cool. It got late into the fall and we just weren't getting good dry down. The plants looked kind of ugly. They were turning yellow, but the ears were still pretty immature. And so we see that reflected in a lower ear dry matter in 2019. 2018 almost caught people off guard in the other way. The plants looked so green and healthy from the road. A lot of people thought there was no way they were ready to harvest, but the ears were so dry at the same time that they actually were ready. And, we can see that if we just pick 35% whole plant dry matter, there was almost a 5% difference in ear dry matter between the 2 years. And we also see on the stover side, it's not quite as dramatic, but again, 2018, when we had those really green, healthy plants, stover dry matter was down here about 25% when whole plant dry matter was 35. And yet a year later, the same hybrids, it was up a few points, right? So we had more of our dry matter being driven by the stover in 2019 compared to 2018 because of the health of the plants. So I think this really highlights, how we maybe can refine our management a little bit more and think about the season we're having, think about plant health going into harvest, and how that drives our harvest decisions for kind of optimizing whole plant dry matter. Because there is an argument to be made that 35% whole plant dry matter may not be the best if the ear is really dry or really wet relative to that whole plant dry matter. So you may, whole plant dry matter may be a little lower or higher if we are really targeting in on where the ear's at. The one thing I would say about that is obviously we just still want the whole plant dry matter in a range that's going to ferment well, right? Even if the ears are really dry or something or not, this only makes sense to tweak our strategy if we're still in a range in the mid 30s where we're still going to get good fermentation. So more on this hybrid study. As I said, we picked a couple shorter stature dual purpose plants, a couple leafy plants. It gave us different average ear to stover ratios and different dry matters at harvest, because we wanted to see how that affected processing score. And so with that, most people are familiar with kernel processing score. I always like to point out it's starch availability, not digestibility, right? You can have really highly digestible kernels, but if they're still whole kernels, they're not available to the rumen. So we often talk about starch digestibility and how we get more digestible as the crop ferments and stuff like that. But really, kernel processing is about starch availability, not the digestibility of it. And so when we look at that in this trial and how these choppers performed, the first thing is we analyzed I don't know, probably 6 or 8 different parameters that we measured. And the two that we found that had the most impact on processing score were ear to stover ratio and ear dry matter. And just to go back to the last slide here, so ear to stover ratio, basically if it was 1, if you had a value of 1, that would mean that the weight of the ear was equal to the weight of the stalk. So you can see our leafies were pretty close to 1. So there's a lot of stover there. And so those ears weighed a little bit more than the stalk, but not very much. You compare that to the dual purpose ones. And, here we have in these cases with these dual purpose ones, the ears weighed almost 50 on average, around 50% more than the stalk weighed. So you had a lot more ear there relative to the stalk. So it would probably make sense to most people that if you have a lot more material, a lot more stover going through the chopper, it's going to be harder for that kernel processor to do its job and really process the kernels well, because you just have a larger volume of material going through the machine. And what we found is for each 1 or 0.1 unit change in ear to stover ratio, it resulted in about 1.7 unit change in kernel processing score. And then ear dry matter was the other one. So as again, probably makes sense to most people, as the kernels get harder and drier, it becomes harder to process them. And we lost about 3/4 of a point of processing score for every point of ear dry matter that increased. So again, getting back to those slides I was showing before, in terms of how we analyze or how we make our harvest decisions based on whole plant dry matter or ear dry matter, we just need to keep in mind that, as those ears dry down in a year like 2018, where we had really green stalks but really hard kernels, we better be paying attention to our processing score. And then one of the questions we often get is, all right, well, how common is a 0.1 unit or a change in ear to stover ratio, and does that really matter to our processing score? So we looked at the range we got in our trials, and within a location, we saw that it could range anywhere from 0.5 to 0.9. So if you take that number and multiply it by that 1.7, that's an 8 to 15 point change in kernel processing score. So that's easily enough to drop you from optimum to adequate, or raise you up from adequate to optimum. So it can be significant. And what it really is just a reminder that if you have different corns growing on your farm, if you have some fields of dual purpose and you have some fields of leafy, when you switch from one field to the next, it can certainly pay to reevaluate processing score, especially if the characteristics of the hybrid are really changing between field locations. Some other data we gleaned off of that study, getting back to the starch content piece, we had these leafies and these dual purpose hybrids. And, over the years, some people have given leafies kind of a bad name for having lower starch content. And we see that in our trial data here. The orange and yellow bars are the two leafies, and they did have lower starch content. But we have to think about what starch content represents. And it represents a percentage of the whole. So, oftentimes we think, oh, lower starch content might be a smaller ear, but we didn't find that in our study. Again, the orange and yellow bars in this case are the weight of the ears. And we see that in most cases, the ear weights on the leafy hybrids were equal to or greater than the dual purpose. So it wasn't smaller ears. It was just simply a factor of that starch in those ears were diluted out by a much larger amount of stover in those dual purpose or leafy hybrids. And I think this gets back to how we analyze stuff, right? Because is starch content really what's important to us? Maybe it is, but what else might be important? Well, starch yield might be important. And, I mentioned that Minor Institute spreadsheet before, but in this case, what if you plug these hybrids in there and looked at the actual yield of starch per acre? So how many pounds of starch per acre are you getting versus what's the concentration of the starch in that corn silage? It's certainly going to, have an impact on how you feed that, what sort of other, ingredients you need in the ration. But it might be a conversation worth having of what's more important to my diet, to my land base, to the forages and ingredients I have available to me. Is it that starch content, or is it, am I trying to maximize the amount of starch yield I'm getting off of my farm? This isn't new data at all, but it was just showing that our study kind of confirmed what a lot of other studies have shown. And that's that if you let corn silage ferment, starch digestibility goes up. And that's one of the, why we recommend trying to ferment corn silage for at least, 3 to 4 months after harvest. One of the big benefits of doing that is increase in starch digestibility. And so this is just a reminder that, and that we found what a lot of other studies have found. And then another piece of information from that study, there's been some suggestions in some articles and stuff over the last few years that not only does starch digestibility go up during fermentation, but maybe even kernel processing score might even go up during fermentation. And if that's the case, maybe we don't have to worry about quite as good of a processing score at harvest, because if we let it ferment, it'll help us out. And Luis Ferretto at Wisconsin shared this slide with me, and there's some good work done by some really good researchers, and it has shown that in some cases in a laboratory setting or under certain parameters that just simply through fermentation that they did get an increase in processing score. However, our data just did not show that at all. If that was the case, so the blue bar is 0 days, the purple bar is 135 days. If we saw a consistent improvement in processing score just from fermentation, we would have seen in every one of these cases the purple bar being higher than the blue bar. And you can see we just don't see any sort of consistency with that. So I'm not here to say that this other data is wrong. I'm just here to say that maybe it's not as straightforward as some data sets have shown, and there's likely more things going on here that we don't even necessarily understand yet. And so I just still encourage people to focus on getting good processing scores in their green samples, because maybe fermentation will help you a little bit, but I don't think you should count on it. And if it does, I guess it's a little bit of a bonus to you. But I'd rather err on the side of making sure I'm happy with where I am the day I harvest. So I think there's only one more slide here, and it's kind of shifting gears to a totally different topic. But the reason I threw it in here is because it has to do with our corn silage hybrid trials. We go to a lot of work to plant these trials each year and to compare these hybrids. And we're always looking for other ways to glean more information off of the trials. And one project we got funded here in New York to do that was trying to look at corn nitrogen use efficiency. So, in the case of the 2020 growing season that I shared before, we had 90 different hybrids planted across different locations. So we had the exact same nitrogen management within a field. Unlike a nitrogen response trial where we would plant the same hybrid and put down different rates of nitrogen to see if there was a nitrogen response. In this case, we flipped that scenario. We had the exact same nitrogen management in the field, but we had a whole bunch of different hybrids being grown side by side. So it gave us an opportunity to look a little further into, was there really genetic differences in nitrogen use efficiency between these hybrids grown under the same growing conditions? And this is still kind of a work in progress, but a few interesting things I just thought I'd share to wrap up. Nitrogen uptake and silage yield. This isn't anything new. This is again kind of confirming that, yep, if you have higher yields, the plant is taking up more nitrogen to get there. But what's been interesting is a lot of people draw the assumption from this that, well, that means I need more nitrogen to get higher yields. And to some extent you do, right? I mean, there's we know that nitrogen rates can boost yield, but we also know that there's a point of diminishing return with that. And that you can't just keep on pouring on nitrogen and get more yield. It reaches a point where it doesn't work that way anymore. And what was interesting with this study is we looked at nitrogen use efficiency versus yield, and we see that there's a linear relationship where the higher yielding hybrids actually use the nitrogen more efficiently. So they didn't have more access to more nitrogen necessarily, or have more nitrogen given to them to get those higher yields. They had access to the same amount of nitrogen as some of these other hybrids. They just simply used it more efficiently to get a higher yield out of it than some of their counterparts in the same field. So this work's kind of ongoing, and there's still more to come, but we just it's kind of interesting to look at how adaptable some of these hybrids are, and how there are some differences there in terms of not just how much total nitrogen they need, but how efficiently they can use it. So that's what I had for slides, and I know that I see the chat box blinking a few times, but so.
Great. Wow. Thanks, Joe. That was great. It's nice that you have taken so much time and effort to look at all this data. It was making me feel really bad that we haven't done the same thing. So I'm glad that you have, and just so much more to offer about the results. So that was just really great. We did put the link up in the chat box so people could access that. And there were a few questions, but I thought they were, something we could wait till the end. So I can ask you the questions. And again, if folks have questions, get them into the chat box. We have time today to get those answered, so that's great. So one of the questions you kind of addressed a little bit, thoughts on high chopping. When we assume undigestible NDF will be high if feed inventory is adequate, what about pre-harvest sampling corn samples that are chipped to get a trend? So that might actually be two questions. So first, high chopping, and then
I think that Penn State summary from Greg Roth that I shared a link to in the slides is probably one of the best summaries. I mean, that summarizes a handful of studies that have been done on chopping height. And so when we leave that lower stock in the field, we're definitely leaving some of that undigestible fiber in the field too. And just simply, again, what else does high chopping do? It changes our ear to stover ratio, right? So we've we spent some time talking about the impact of ear to stover ratio on some of these numbers. So leaving more stock in the field is effectively changing that ear to stover ratio. So certainly in times when we have either where inventory might be actually abundant, and so if do we ask ourselves, do we leave a little more in the field, or do we create a temporary drive over pile that is probably gonna, half of it's gonna rot away because we can't get it packed and covered really well or something, right? Then in those cases, I think we could say, well, let's just leave some of that UNDF out in the field. Let's change that ear to stover ratio and make better use of our storage space. And then, yeah, I mean, I have heard of some farms chipping down samples pre-harvest and sending them to the lab and actually cutting stalks at different cutting heights to send them to the lab and see, like, kind of get an idea of what the fiber digestibilities are going to be at different cutting heights even before harvest, and helping you make that decision. If the farm or the advisor on the farm is willing to go to that extent, I think it's a great thing, for sure. Frankly, I don't know how many people are always willing to do that, but I think it'd be a good goal to strive for if you are.
Great. If you're not looking at trial results, how do you suggest that a farm make an informed decision on what hybrids to plant each year?
I guess I don't know quite where that's coming from, but one, I think, sometimes we're maybe a little cynical about company data. I mean, yeah, there's always examples of someone that might try to pull something over on you, but in general, these companies are highly competitive, and they're only going to bring their best hybrids to market because they just can't afford to do otherwise. And they have really good internal data. A lot of these companies have really good internal data programs. So there's a lot of data there, and that's why I say, some of our public data, I hope, can be used to kind of calibrate yourself to the season, and that makes a certain company's internal data more valuable to look at, because you've been calibrated to what happened that season. But again, I would just, the agronomics are important, obviously, the pest management, pest traits that you might need on your farm, and whether it's the company's data or public trial data, just try to find something that gives you a sense of how it performed compared to, ideally how it performed compared to its peers, not just numbers that look flashy when you don't know the context of them.
Great. Let's see what else we have here. Another question about how much of the site-to-site variability that you regularly observe do you attribute to soil type or fertility as opposed to weather?
That's a good point. And Dairy One had a study, I don't know, it's probably been 5-6 years ago now, but they actually reported some data where they found some statistically significant differences between soil types, and a trend where heavier soil types tended to lead to poorer fiber digestibility. And so we've looked into that a little bit, and we have found in our trials where if rainfall and everything else is equal, then yes, heavier soils do seem to have a little bit less fiber digestibility. But if rainfall is different, the site with the higher rainfall take a bigger hit, even if it's a better drained soil. So there is some potential there, that soil types can matter from a fiber standpoint. But again, it gets overshadowed by rainfall. And what was the other?
There's a net. I think that was it,
Okay.
basically. And there is a question. Have you analyzed any of your corn plot data across years and locations as a larger data set? Any associations with certain weather season patterns?
Yeah, we're trying to get to that point. I mean, that's really our kind of next goal. And now that we have a number of years of data, so we're just feeling like our data set's getting big enough to start to play around with some of that stuff. Because the other thing that's changed over time is some of the stuff we measure for, right? We have data from the early 2000s from some of these locations when Bill Cox was doing the trials, but we were maybe lucky if we had an NDF digestibility 24-hour or 30-hour value with that data, and no one was even talking about UNDF then, or some of these other values, right? So we can't really mine those older data sets very well, just because we weren't analyzing the same forage quality parameters back then. So that's our next step now that we've got multiple years, and we feel like we're building up a big enough data set that we can start to do that.
Great. Yeah, that will be definitely exciting, and hopefully we'll continue to keep those trials going. All right, we do have another question. If there are any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Otherwise, I think this is a really good question to end on. Oh, now somebody put another question after I said this. What's next for corn silage in the Northeast? What is the future, Joe? Where are we headed?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It's a good question. I tell people I'm kind of boring with this stuff. I just feel like there's so much more potential to refine what we're already doing. I don't necessarily get kind of caught up in some of the trends that jump out and that sort of thing. Because I just, like some of the stuff I talked about today, it wasn't new, right? It's stuff we've been talking about for 20 years, yet we still know that there's progress to be made on a lot of farms and a lot of stuff we can do. So I'm excited about just refining some of this stuff more. That might not be the most exciting answer, but there are some cool new trade ideas and stuff out there, but I think we can gain a lot just through continuing to refine some of this stuff.
Yeah, so nobody asked me that question, but but one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking, Joe, is that the way that farmers are growing corn in the Northeast and across New England now are starting to integrate all of these conservation practices, from no-till and cover cropping and interseeding and just all these other practices that aren't always necessarily aligned with what we've been telling people to do to produce, high yielding crops. And, some of the data we collected last year from the variety trials, and thinking about some extra info we might be able to pull out of our trial results, was we looked at a whole host of varieties and how they, if they responded differently to interseeding cover crops, or if
Mm,
the cover crop responded differently.
yeah.
And, my assumption was that if it was a really high yielding corn silage variety grown under kind of our normal conditions, that cover crop wouldn't grow very well. It would be
Mhm.
too dense and too shady. But what we actually found was that one of the highest yielding varieties resulted in the highest cover crop biomass.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and the lowest yielding variety also did. And it was it was kind of completely
Yeah.
opposite of what I thought would happen. And so it just started making me think, and there's a lot of people looking at this right now, is what are the types of varieties that are appropriate for those types of management systems where people are, trying to interseed, um, or, high residue systems, or yeah, no till, just these different practices that may ultimately influence what varieties we're choosing.
That's a great point, Heather. And yeah, I mean, and that's something I failed to mention related to the relative maturity and tightening up those relative maturities. Another reason to do that is cover crops, right? I mean, I was trying to make the point that from a forage quality standpoint, the pros and cons of the yield trade-off with and stuff, but at the end of the day, another potential there is our compatibility with cover crops in the short season we have in the Northeast here, right? And well, actually, Heather, we put in a grant a few years ago to try to
That's
get
right. Yeah.
some more shorter season corns into the trials so that we could um, have a more robust data set of short season corns and just how do they perform relative to some of the longer ones. So unfortunately, it wasn't funded that time around, but I think it is still definitely a good topic. And
Yeah.
if you want to hear one kind of off the wall thing, um, if we're thinking about the future,
Yeah.
I was contacted by a researcher at Cornell last fall from that I'd never met before. He's not in ag or not in like ag in the Northeast, but he does more basic research. And he had some data overseas showing how some legume crops interseeded with corn actually changed some stress responses in the corn plant and it actually reduced the incidences of mycotoxins
Hmm.
in the corn because of these interactions,
Yeah.
biochemical interactions between the legumes and the corn plant and how that changed its stress response. So he contacted me and was kind of quizzing me about how our crop rotations in the Northeast and how cover crops um, fit into those and whether we could potentially do intercropping versus just cover cropping. And so we had an interesting conversation, and I think it's still a long ways off and somewhat still theoretical, but it was just, when we talk about some kind of crazy things that might be out there, what if we're intercropping these crops in a couple of decades from now and figuring out that sort of system, and there's benefits like reduced mycotoxins and stuff like that. So there's
Yeah.
some kind of interesting stuff out there.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we don't know what we don't know, right?
yeah.
So definitely, especially when we start talking below ground, things become even more complicated. And I think a lot of interesting opportunities there. So, well, I think we're right at about 2 o'clock. If there's any final questions or comments, I definitely appreciated someone, just saying that they got a lot out of the webinar series, and that's why we hold these. And I think we had one about this time last March, and we were all feeling a little bit different than we are now, afraid to go outside even. So it was nice to have that webinar for people to tap into. And now, um, just I feel excited for the upcoming growing season, and can't wait to get that corn, Joe, and start putting it in the ground. So
Yeah, Keith, I was talking to Keith and Sherry earlier. They're counting out seed packets now.
there we
So,
go. Yeah.
but and so sorry, but just one more thing, because
Yeah.
I just was glancing at the chat myself here, and I see the little question back to Alan's question and a response from John. But so I mean, there's other. I mentioned how that data from Dairy One related to soil type, but we've really seen it overshadowed by rainfall. But certainly, again, going back to the agronomics, I mean, there are legitimate reasons to look at companies' hybrid portfolios, and we talk about defensive hybrids versus offensive ones, and what are their stress tolerance packages, and certainly refining your hybrid selection in that way when it comes to poorer drain soils, or maybe a valley condition where you have higher humidity and tend to have more disease pressure in a microclimate like a valley between the mountains. Then I didn't intend to gloss over the fact that there are some important reasons to think about your hybrid selection in those scenarios. I just was focused more in on the fiber part of it, but I think there's yeah, we have to balance the agronomic side of it too, right? And picking those pest traits and stress tolerances that are going to work on our soil types and microclimates. So
Yeah. Well, it's 2 o'clock, everyone. And thank you, Joe, so much. It was really great to have you join us. And I know I got a lot out of it, and I'm sure everybody else did too. I'm sure Joe won't mind if anybody follows up with him with other questions if you have them. And please take a look at the trial reports. We have a lot of them on our website, not just corn, but all types of variety evaluation programs, and they're really critical, I think, to probably one of the number one farming decisions people need to make. So please make sure you access those, and they're widely available. All right. Well, with that, thank you again, Joe. Enjoy spring, and we'll be chatting with you about the trial soon.
sounds good. Have a
All
good day,
right.
everyone.
Thanks. Bye.